Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. We got a great panel. Max Alvarez, Emily Jashinsky. We've got Chuck Rocha on. He's got a new breakdown of what really happened with Latino voters this fall. That's really important. Got Ryan Grimm on. He's talking about Schumer considering taking another crack at the minimum wage. Will this time be any more successful than the first time? But we wanted to start with the big infrastructure package that is coming together as we speak.
That's right. Build Back Better. The president going to be revealing that formally in Pittsburgh, but most of the details leaking out here. Friend of the show, Jeff Steins, basically got it all. Basically, here's what we got. They're going to break it up into two parts. As I understand it, they think they can get the first part more easily through reconciliation or possibly even through a regular order. Physical infrastructure, that's the most popular part, roads and bridges, clean energy, R&D investment, domestic manufacturing push, dollars for child care and school facilities, and home-based care for the disabled and elderly. Part two would be the extension of that child tax allowance that was for 1 year, paid family medical leave, expansion of health care, and the large child benefit in the stimulus. Now, what they're pairing that with, Krystal, is an openness to raising taxes basically across the board, a push on the corporate tax cut, people making more than $400,000 a year, and more. But the special interests are already going to bat on several things. Our personal favorite is this one. The head of the the Problem Solvers Caucus.
That's the one.
Josh Geithammer. Let's put this up there on the screen. He says that he will not vote for any bill which does not have reinstating the SALT deduction for wealthy New Yorkers and San Franciscans. Simply put, Gottheimer said, quote, no SALT, no dice. And the other best part that I've seen here, Krystal, which is that capital gains taxes and other financial transaction taxes, which are some of the easiest ways in order to tax wealth and actually accumulate a ton of revenue. Senator Chuck Schumer of the state of New York has formally vetoed any such inclusions in there. Now, look, I'm not saying all these tax increases are bad. I largely support, increasing corporate tax rate up to 28 and many of the other ones that are within there. But it's just, look, it's like the idea that just the Republicans are the ones there working on some of the rich. They're probably just doing it more so than some of these other people. It's pretty crazy. And at the end result, we are going to see, I suspect, the SALT is almost certainly going to have to be in there because Gottheimer speaks for a lot of New York and California Democratic congresspeople who represent very wealthy districts who this is their top priority for their wealthy constituents. Top. And reminder, SALT only applies to people basically who are worth over $1 million a year. $1 million a year. Those are the only people who benefit from this
That's the Democratic Party base.
That is it.
In fairness, Gottheimer represents New Jersey, not New York, but similar deal. Look, let me start with the good here. We had some initial details that leaked last week, and the numbers were quite a bit lower.
Right.
So it seems like after they floated that trial balloon and the response came back basically like, actually, you should do even more. They have expanded their proposal, which is good because they were offering a fraction of what even Joe Manchin said they should do on infrastructure. So now what they're looking at is $3 trillion in new spending and $1 trillion in new tax hikes. We don't have a whole lot of details. Earlier was leaked some of the potential tax hike measures. They were thinking about a global minimum tax. They were thinking about increasing the top corporate the corporate tax rate. They were thinking about increasing capital gains rates for assets over $1 million. So there were some provisions like that, all of which I support, none of which would hit anyone under $400,000 a year. That was the line in the sand that Joe Biden had floated. But in those initial tax hike proposals, they were very clear, no to SALT. And it's just always interesting which Democrats are willing to go super hard and over what provisions. Yeah, like the fact that you're willing to be like, I will blow this whole thing up
for a multi-million
if I don't get the SALT tax cap back. Oh my God. And meanwhile, progressives, of course, will be like, well, we'd like it to be a little bit better, but it's fine. We'll still vote for it.
And then all the GOP will vote against it, even though it's got like 80% approval rating.
It tells you absolutely everything. So that's interesting. The other nugget that I don't think is getting enough attention here, and again, these things are all fluid. What was reported last week's a little bit different than what they're floating this week. We'll get the final details on part one, the infrastructure package, this week from Joe Biden in Pittsburgh. But, when they passed the relief bill, one of the big cases that was made was like, the reason this is transformational is because of this child tax credit. And sure, It's only for a year, but we are definitely going to extend it. It's definitely going to be made permanent. You can take it to the bank. Like, that was the messaging around it. There's a lot of talk about how it cuts child poverty rates by half. All wonderful things, although you want to see it before you actually count those chickens and see the way that it impacts poverty, but definitely a good program. They've already cut that out and are already like, nah, we're actually not going to do that part. They've already trimmed their sails on that one.
Especially if they're going to do reconciliation, there is no guarantee you get 2 reconciliations or 3 reconciliations in a year. That's the real thing. So my favorite episode of this entire thing is the always politically talented Pete Buttigieg, now Transportation Secretary. He came out and floated possibly the dumbest political thing I've ever seen. He's like, yeah, maybe we'll pay for this thing by a gas tax, or not a gas tax, a vehicle by mile tax. And I was like, oh my. I mean, we were talking about this. That is peak consultant brain. They're like, well, it's actually quite efficient of a gas tax.
Yeah.
It's also called a tax on the South and people who work and live in larger areas and would be disproportionately biased against them, especially a vehicle by mile tax. It's just one of the most classic and stupid political moves that you can make. And it's something that was very popular amongst like 1970s Democrats back in like the, what was it? The McGovern age, like something like that, really politically successful people. Bill Clinton famously lost his first governorship because he increased a gas tax. It's like probably the least popular thing that you can do, even however you feel about the merits. So the Biden administration, and also, of course, is seized upon by Republicans everywhere. They're like, gas tax. Have you been to the pump recently? I recently bought a car. Gas has actually gotten a little bit more expensive. And even I'm like, I can't pay any more gas tax. And of course, Biden has trotted out Buttigieg. He had to trot him back out on TV. And he's like, you better retract that gas tax right now. And here's what we got.
As of right now, is raising taxes on wealthier Americans the primary funding source for your plan?
Well, you're going to hear more details from the administration in the coming days about how to pay for this. But one thing I will do is reiterate the president's commitment that his proposals will not raise taxes at all on anyone making under $400,000 a year.
You said also that a mileage tax showed, quote, a lot of promise as a way to help pay for the plan. That tax would charge people for how many miles they drive. Is that under consideration?
No, that's not part of the conversation about this infrastructure bill. So just want to make sure that's really clear. But you will be hearing a lot more details in the coming days.
Clean that one up.
Clearly,
maybe
because he's the one who put it out there.
Yeah,
and they clearly had to book that interview. They're like, you need to get this thing under control right now.
This is where this is where you can be so smart you're stupid, right? Like, this is classic technocrat McKinsey brain. Where like, we crunched the numbers and we did this spreadsheet and the regression analysis over 30 years and the fund is getting depleted. It's like, no, this is a political disaster. It's completely regressive. I mean, like, you're saying, look, this is so obvious. This is so incredibly obvious. Cities are expensive. So working class people have to work in cities. They live outside the city where it's less expensive, and they drive in and they commute in, and this would disproportionately impact them. Maybe Pete's like a secret accelerationist and he's trying to spark a Yellow Vest movement here in the U.S. Maybe that's what's really going on. Anyway, he cleaned that one up, so looks like conservatives can calm down about their gas tax, apocalyptic rhetoric, et cetera, et cetera. And we're still getting the details on this thing, but there is already some progressive pushback against some of the provisions here. Justice Dems put out a statement saying that the amount that's being floated here, $400 billion, woefully inadequate in terms of dealing with upgrading every home, school, mode of transportation, building to 100% clean energy to act on climate. So you're starting to see a little bit of pushback from the left. I also saw the progressives in the House put out a separate proposal with a much larger dollar figure in terms of what they think should be invested in infrastructure over the long term. So we'll see how all of this kind of settles out. But, the big question with all of this is, what mechanism do they use to get it through? Chuck Schumer thinks that he can sort of rig the rules in the Senate or work the rules in the Senate such that normally you get 2 reconciliation bites at the apple in a year. He's thinking maybe he can be able to get 3. So that would be, the first one was the relief bill. The second one presumably would be this infrastructure package. And the third one presumably would be the child care and the other social welfare provisions, about which we know a little bit less. I would say the infrastructure pieces have a much higher likelihood of getting through. None of it's going to get through regular order. Like, there's just zero chance that Republicans are going to vote for any of this. The minute you say tax hike on anyone for anything, even the most odious and people who, deserve to be taxed a whole lot more than even Biden is proposing, the minute you say tax hike, they're out. So the only way you're going to get it is through reconciliation. And they've got a big task ahead of them just to keep all the Democrats on board, just to be able to work this process, keep all the Democrats together, keep Kirsten Sinema in line, keep the SALT tax caucus in line, keep Joe Manchin in line, who had previously said he didn't want to do anything else without having some Republican support. Now, he hasn't said that in a while. I have a feeling he's kind of calming down on that hard line that he had drawn before, but none of this is certain, and we'll see how hard they're willing to push here ultimately.
There's two ways this goes. This could be both the dream scenario, where you push a piece of dramatically popular legislation without any, to the extent that there's added stuff in it that the conservatives complain about. This one is very low on that totem pole. It could be even more popular, actually, than the COVID relief bill. Well, maybe not as much, but similar. And I think that is one way it could happen. The other is this could turn into Biden's Obamacare nightmare, where you have to cobble together all of the Democratic caucus, it turns out, who have very differing priorities, House and the Senate. He could have a SALT tax debacle. Joe Manchin may not want to raise taxes on so-and-so. And then you get some crazy stuff in there, and it could turn into an organic, Tea Party backlash. I don't think
Manchin
that
could
will necessarily
bulk at some
happen.
of the climate change pieces.
There you go. So climate change may not be within there. And then there's maybe some progressive senators. I doubt it, but would say I won't vote for this. I'm just I could foresee, especially with such a razor thin minority, this could turn into a 9-month debacle over nobody knows what tax to agree on. Actually, some Democrats agree with some of the Trump tax cuts and all that and don't want to reverse it, especially on the corporate tax. And it's actually going to be very revealing. Anytime the tax discussion comes up, it's a lot of fun here in D.C.
The last thing I will say about our friend Mayor Pete is he is now in the position of being especially if this infrastructure package actually gets passed, of being the power broker of helping to determine whose pet infrastructure projects in their district ultimately get funded. I was reading about, his confirmation hearing, and part of why it was so friendly is because all of these people want to cozy up to him so that they can get the money funded into their states and into their districts.
Great.
So,
giving Pete power. What could go wrong?
Yeah, that's great. That's really wonderful. All right, we're going to tell you what's on our radars. That's next.